In this video, I'm going to talk about how to make your turrets rotate to face a target. So the first thing to do is let's look at the makeup of my turret. I've got my turret game object here. Underneath it are the visuals for this turret. And then inside the visuals for the turret, I have these objects called Bone 1, Bone 2, and Bone 3. Notice how Bone 1, Bone 2, and Bone 3, they're just transforms. So they're basically just game objects. And they actually work hand in hand with these, the barrel, base, and pivot, with this skinned mesh renderer to actually set the positions of these objects to where they should be. Basically what that means is when I want to be rotating my turret, I don't want to rotate this game object because I don't want to run on the ground. I don't want to rotate this object, which is just the visuals. I don't want to rotate this bone object here, this bone 1. But bone 2 looks pretty good if I want to be able to rotate it. Now, your turrets might be something slightly different, so you might want to rotate something different. But I'm going to rotate this object here. So what I want to do is I want to rotate bone 2. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is on my turret, I'm going to set up a sphere collider. The sphere collider is going to represent the area in which this turret can shoot. So I want to, or at least the area in which this turret will aim at enemies. So I'm going to make this relatively large. I'll make it this size just for testing, but you can increase and decrease the radius based on when you want this turret to start aiming at enemies. Cool. I've also got a script machine here, and I've also got some variables, which we'll talk about in a few more minutes. Now, I've also set up a default sphere object, which is just a regular sphere with a sphere collider as well as a rigid body on it. And this kind of represents a target that your turret would potentially rotate towards. When I hit play, it's just going to fall into my collider, and so it's going to sort of do its detection on this object here. All right, let's start talking about some of the specifics of this graph. Now, this might look a little confusing at first, but I'll go through the whole thing. All right, the first thing is we want to set up our object variables. Now, when we're running this logic, we know that we don't want to rotate the turret itself, and we want to rotate bone 2. So the first thing to do is set up an object variable that references bone 2. And I've done that here by just calling it something. I set the type to game object, and then I clicked bone 2 and I dragged it into the value here. So now I have a variable that represents the object I would like to rotate in order to face the object, or in order to face the target. The next thing is I also have a rotation speed. So I want my turret to rotate smoothly. I don't want it to snap to face the object. So this script will get a little bit more complex because of that. But I want to make my turret look, nice and smooth. So I'm going to have my turret rotate to face an enemy as opposed to just snapping to the rotation that it should be to aim directly at it. Okay, now that we have the object set up, let's look at the logic in order to do this. I'm going to use this event called onTriggerStay. Now remember that onTriggerStay is a callback that happens. This thing fires off whenever you have a trigger and whenever there's an object within it. So if I go back and take a look at my game object here for my turret, and I go look at my sphere collider, this is flagged as a trigger, which means that it's not a solid object. It's not a solid collider. Things will not bounce off of it. It will move. Objects will move smoothly through it. But I will get notifications in this onTriggerStay, or also onTriggerEnter and onTriggerExit. But most importantly right now, this onTriggerStay when there's an object within it. So when there's an object within it, I essentially want to go through this process of determine where the object is and figure out which direction I would need to look at, need to rotate towards in order to aim at that object, and then rotate slowly to face that object. That's essentially what I want to do. So the first thing, based on the output from this onTriggerStay, the collider, this is the collider of the object that is causing this onTriggerStay to happen. So it's going to be the enemies or my targets. Now, remember, your logic might be different. You probably need to do some sort of filtering or some if statement here based on, is this an actual enemy and not another turret that's next to me, or something else along those lines. But for my case, in my example here, I don't need to do that. So I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. Based on the collider that I'm hitting, I'm going to get the attached rigid body. From the attached rigid body, I'm going to get its position. And that position, if I subtract from it my own position, that will give me the direction I need to orient myself in order to face the target. So these are two vectors in 3D space, two positions. And when you subtract two positions in 3D space, it gives you a direction. and it's a direction from one of those positions to the other position. And if you want to know more about this, more is talked about in 3D math and programming logic and future programming courses, or definitely feel free to post questions, and happy to talk about more 3D math like this. So we're going to subtract these positions away from each other, and that gives us a direction. I'm going to use this unit here called quaternion look rotation. Quaternion look rotation generates an orientation. It generates a rotation based on a forward direction and an upwards direction. So if you imagine that you are pointing in a direction with your hand, and that's what the forward direction sort of does for you. The upwards direction would be the rotation of your hand. So you can point out in front of you, but you could rotate your hand around a circle, around in any angle, and still point at the same object. The upwards direction sort of indicates which direction should be upwards from the object. So I'm just going to leave that as 0, 1, 0. So upwards in the y direction. Okay, now that we have the rotation that we would like to rotate to in order to face the object, now I'm going to use this unit called rotate towards. Rotate towards generates an amount of rotation from one rotation to another rotation based on a maximum number of degrees between them. So this is sort of like, it allows you to say, I want to go from my current rotation to this new one, and I want to do so at this maximum speed. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to get the rotation of my barrel, and I'm going to feed that in as the rotation I'm rotating from. The direction I'm rotating to is what I've generated from the look rotation to my target. And then the max degrees delta, I'm going to take my delta time, multiply by a rotation speed, which determines how fast I can rotate, multiply those things together, and then that's going to be my max degrees delta. I'm going to go ahead and increase this value to 15 because I know it's going to be a little slow at just 1. Finally, I'm going to set the rotation of my barrel equal to this rotation that I'm generating from this rotate towards. So relatively simple. Calculate a direction, use look rotation, use this rotate towards to rotate it, and then finally set the rotation of my barrel. Let's go and see what this thing looks like when I go hit play. All right, so you can see the spheres fell here and that my turret is rotating. But it's not rotating exactly how I would expect it to. So let's take a closer look at exactly what's going on here. If I select my sphere and I move it, okay, so you can kind of see what's happening. It's rotating to make the top of my barrel face the sphere, which isn't exactly what I want. So one of the common strategies that I do whenever something like this happens, where my rotations aren't behaving the way that I want them to, is first ask myself, is the logic working correctly? And the answer is yes. I'm going to go increase my rotation speed again. It's like 30. The rotation logic is working correctly. It's just at this weird angle. So if I select my bone 2, we can see that what it's doing is it's taking the forward direction, which is the blue arrow here. It's taking the forward direction of this object, and that's what it's aligning, and that's what it's aiming towards the sphere. The blue arrow from this, and I have this set to local, so I can see the local axes of this object. The blue arrow is always aligning itself to the sphere. So I know that my logic is working correctly. I just have this strange orientation. Well, one way to fix this is to make use of our hierarchy. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now, and I'll show you how. I want this rotation to behave the exact same way, right? And this is essentially like if I disable the visuals of the turret, and instead I just looked at the rotation of this object, and I asked myself, hey, is this rotating correctly? I'd say, yeah. But then when I turn the visuals on, all the rotations aren't correct. So I'm going to make use of my hierarchy. I'm going to right-click on bone 2, and I'm going to create an empty parent object here, which is all zeroed out for position rotation. And then, instead of rotating bone 2, I'm going to rotate this empty game object. And I can do that by selecting my turret, and I'm going to take this empty game object that I've inserted into the hierarchy here, and I'm going to set that as the new target in which to rotate this object, right? So now it's rotating this new game object. So you can see the new game object position, the blue arrows facing it, right? Now this gives me the freedom to take bone 2, and I can zero out the rotation here. And then I can modify the rotation of this thing to whatever I want it to be, in order to line it up. And I can rotate its position and so forth. So I can punch in -90 for my rotation here. I can hit, adjust my orientation and get something that looks like this. Great. And now as I move my sphere around, perfect. My turret is rotating to face the direction of my sphere. So that's how you can get turrets to rotate based on current speeds to positions of targets. Layered on top of this, you probably need to do some sort of filtering to make sure these targets are enemies. You might also want to do some sort of filtering or determination of what should happen when there's no longer a target available for you, or something else along those lines as well.